Richard Calloway had never once crouched behind a flower pot since that summer when he was 7 years old. Now at 58, with a net worth that swelled past $400 million depending on market tides, he commanded a staff of drivers, security personnel, and 3 assistants who orchestrated his days with the precision of seasoned pilots guiding aircraft. Yet here he stood, pressed against a stone planter on his own estate's driveway, because a small 10-year-old boy had seized his sleeve and spoken with absolute certainty, "Don't move. Follow me." Richard had followed, though the reason eluded him. The boy, whose name was Theo, crouched beside him now, finger pressed to his lips in hushed secrecy. Theo was the grandson of George, the estate's groundskeeper, visiting for the weekend while his mother traveled for work. George apologized twice for the boy's intrusion, but Richard dismissed any concern, though Theo had a habit of materializing where least expected. On Saturday morning, Richard discovered him perched on the library steps, absorbed in a book about migratory birds with the intense focus of genuine inquiry. Theo observed his grandfather taking a phone call on the terrace the next afternoon, studying him with the curious intensity of childhood, then asked, "Do you always look like that when you talk to people?" "Like what?" Richard replied. "Like you're already somewhere else." Richard had no response. Sunday evening brought Theo's sudden grab on his sleeve as Richard walked toward the car, bound for another meeting in another city. "Don't move. Follow me." Richard crouched behind a geranium-filled planter while Darius, his head of security, waited beside the vehicle 20 feet away. "Theo, I have a flight in 90 minutes. "I know," the boy said, not looking at him, eyes fixed on something near the garden gate. "Just wait." Richard obeyed. Then came the sound. A small brown bird had settled on the iron gate post and begun to sing. Not a showy display, merely a simple song, as if the bird had nothing else to do but sing at day's end. Theo watched with rapt attention. "It comes every Sunday," he said. "Same time, same post. Grandpa showed me." Richard examined the gate post where the bird had been. "Your grandfather noticed that. He notices everything that happens in this garden." Theo delivered this matter-of-factly. "He's been working here 12 years. He knows every plant, every bird that visits, which flowers bloom first each morning." A pause. "He says you've never asked him about any of it." Richard fell silent. "He's not upset about it," Theo continued carefully. "He just said it. I asked him what you were like, and that's what he said. You walk through the garden, but you don't really see it." The driveway sat quiet in the evening glow, palm shadows stretching across stone. "You pulled me behind a flower pot," Richard said slowly, "to show me a bird." "I pulled you behind a flower pot so you'd have to stop," Theo replied, looking directly into his eyes. "You were going to walk right past it." "You walk past everything." Richard had no answer. Darius had turned around, watching his employer crouch beside a child with the professional detachment of someone trained not to judge. Richard rose, brushed dust from his jacket, and finally looked at the garden properly, really saw it for perhaps the first time in 7 years. The colors in the fading light, the palms swaying, the stone planters Carol had selected during their travels before the company exploded in value, before his schedule became impenetrable, before silence became impossible. Carol had loved this garden. He had paid handsomely to maintain it beautifully for years, yet never spent enough time to hear a bird sing. He returned to Theo's side on the planter's edge. Darius checked his watch without speaking. "Tell me about the garden," Richard said. Theo nodded seriously, then began. He spoke of geraniums and which varieties bloomed latest, and how George believed the soil pH needed adjustment. He described the white-throated sparrow, a winter visitor arriving each October and departing in April. He explained how the evening light struck the gate at this precise moment in the year, transforming the stone to a color that wasn't gold exactly, but something that knew it was leaving. Richard listened, not the distracted listening of a man already elsewhere, but truly listening. The flight was missed, not with drama, but simply. Richard called his assistant from the driveway. "Reschedule for tomorrow morning." "Is everything all right?" the assistant asked, surprised. "Fine," Richard said, then paused. "Actually, yes, everything's fine." George joined them afterward. The 3 of them strolled through the garden in the last light. George nomming plants and explaining their histories, discussing 12 years of learning each land's unique character. Richard listened with the attention of someone discovering what he'd never known he lacked. When Theo returned inside for the evening, he paused at the door and looked back. "Same time next Sunday?" he asked. "The bird." Richard glanced at the gate post. "I'll be here." Theo nodded, content, and disappeared inside. George lingered a moment after his grandson left, and Richard finally met his gaze directly, for the first time in 12 years of polite morning exchanges. "I owe you a conversation," Richard said. "Several, probably." George smiled the smile of a man who'd waited long enough and didn't need the apology, only to accept it. "The garden will still be here," he said. "It always is." Richard didn't transform overnight. The business continued its operations. The calendar filled as usual. The flights departed on schedule, but something fundamental had shifted. A quiet revolution in the space between a stone planter and an iron gate post, during those 40 seconds of a small bird singing at Sunday's end. He began walking through the garden with his eyes open, learning names, asking questions, savoring answers. Every Sunday evening at the appointed hour, he stood at the gate waiting for that small brown bird his groundskeeper's grandson deemed worth stopping the world for. Richard realized it was, in truth, the most valuable thing anyone had done for him in years. All it required was a 10-year-old's grip on his sleeve and the words, "Don't move, follow me," followed by a man's decision to stop walking past everything.